Is the time to double down on the support that we provide Ukraine. I've been having meetings with leaders from the United States and across Europe, and we are united in our determination to ensure Ukraine succeeds and that Russia fails. And I want everyone to follow our lead in giving Ukraine that support. But not only do we need to help them win the war, we also need to ensure a lasting peace, and that's something that I've also been talking to allies about today. We're at a pivotal moment in this conflict where if we provide Ukraine with the extra means that they need, then they can turn the tide and liberate their country. We will happily provide assistance to any country that is able to provide Ukraine with fighter jets right now. The UK stands ready to support those countries as well. For our part, we're also leading the world in training Ukrainian pilots on NATO standard aircraft. That's the right thing to do, because this is about giving Ukraine the means to defend themselves and win this war. That's about more air defence, it's about armoured vehicles, it's about long-range weapons. The UK is out in front in all of these things, and it's important that we continue to do so and lead, because we all want to see Ukraine succeed.
Well, fighting talk there from Richie, and let's now speak to our political commentator with Young Voices UK, and that's Portia Berry-Kilby. Good morning to you, Portia. Good morning. Now, listening to that, I mean, that is fighting talk from Richie there, but what sort of reaction and support is he getting, do you think, from the other European leaders that were at that conference? Are they just as gung-ho about this as he is?
Well, I think they are, but at the same time, the UK has been leading to some extent since Boris Johnson's very much zealous commitment to supporting Ukraine and the things that they need there. But I think what's particularly interesting is that he has called for European leaders to come together, double down, especially insofar as provision of fighter jets. And naturally, this is necessary because it's not simply the case of one country giving a jet over. Often the fighter jets aren't solely sovereign, so you do need other countries in support of providing them for those to be given. But of course, this is a long-term strategy, and you can't just drop off a plane and then expect things to be fine. The training of pilots, the maintenance of the jets themselves means that nothing will be happening anytime too soon with that. But the other tactics that are needed to support Ukraine are more important.
Yeah, Portia, I think that's a key point that you brought up there. £2.1 billion has already been given last year. Talks of doubling down sound very expensive. And these jets cannot be deployed straight away, can they? This is more about the longer-term strategic protection of Ukraine. And in that case, it's actually the UK taking a more long-term and active role in security. And how will that go down, do you think, with Mr. Putin?
Well, this is the real problem, isn't it? And as soon as the UK mentions the prospect of fighter jets, it's like, well, what extent are you actually not active in this war? The same for every European nation, right? They don't want to be actively involved, but the distinction between supporting and then actively supporting is, of course, becoming blurred. So those things, it's a diplomatic nightmare, of course, but at the same time, the UK's vocal support of Ukraine has been there. The financial backing has been there. It's no surprise what side of the party they fall on. And I think it's only fair for Rishi Sunak to then say, put your money where the mouth is. If you want Ukraine to win, then why aren't you financially supporting them to do that?
It was interesting. I heard one of the Ukrainian generals saying he was asked how long he thinks the war is likely to go on. And he was talking in terms of us still being there this time next year. And what is quite interesting that Bob Seeley, who's the MP for the Isle of Wight, former soldier, was saying today it is just not realistic that we can expect Ukraine to survive without help. So this is going to be for the long term, isn't it?
Entirely. And of course, the UK is sending Challenger 2 tanks over at the end of March. This is still 6 weeks away. The war isn't going to be over in those 6 weeks. There has to be a longer term strategy. And the hope is that Ukraine can reclaim some of the land that it's lost. There's no kind of expectation that the war will be deemed over before that happens. Ukraine are going to go down fighting. So if they're not going to be able to not only hold Russia back, but also make progress to returning to the state they were in, then the war will be dragged out further and further. I think the general consensus is that if you want the war to end, it's better to happen sooner than later. And of course, that needs the support now. It can't be given. You need the commitment to the long-term support now. You can't give it in like a year's time, because these things, as already said, take time. It takes working out So at least Rishi Sunak has been vocal already, and the other states were. The US, of course, even said that they deem Russia to be guilty of crimes against humanity. So if that's not enough to kind of rally European leaders to do more, then I don't really know what is.
I think this is very clever strategy, because at first it was helmets, then it was tanks, now it's jets. I mean, how long maybe before we have peacekeeping troops? But of course, all of these things early on in the conflict would have been seen as very provocative acts. But this slower creep towards involvement, it's canny strategy, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's always, the response is, it's not the UK or Europeans that are escalating this, it's the Russians, and this is therefore a proportionate response. And I think that's important, that it isn't seen that the UK is escalating things by sending in tanks or jets straight away, but it's in response to continued aggression from Russia.
But it is a very fine line, isn't it, between us supporting them and actually sending our own troops there. And I'm sure that NATO, all those NATO countries that are bordering the Ukraine, are very, very aware of that. But I wonder, Portia, you represent Young Voice UK. How anxious are young people that this is a war that is just going to continue, and that before we know it, we're all going to be dragged into it one way and another, not just providing armaments, but actually having to step over the line and take a physical part in this war?
Well, I think that's a very different question from where we are now. And I think the reality of it is, for better or for worse, there isn't exactly the appetite for full-out war amongst the British public, let alone Britain's young people. I think ask anyone and they're not going to say, oh, sure, I'll go and fight. And we're seeing in the army we have fewer soldiers than most years in recent history. So these things all are going to be a huge calculation. And there's obviously a massive escalation if we're talking about sending troops to Ukraine. And we've had Ben Wallace say over the past few days that we also need to focus on UK military and defence here at home. And the war in Ukraine has highlighted UK's vulnerabilities, and there needs to be more efforts from both the Prime Minister and the Treasury that the UK defence is in the position it should be.
Portia, thank you very much indeed for that. Thanks for joining us. I think we'll be talking to you also a bit later in the programme today.
Yeah, and it's also a fascinating re-emergence of former allies, reaching out to Poland, USA to take a lead on this. So in many ways, I think it's a very clever strategy.